any man listed, and he's talking about the people who do not believe the King James is the only reliable Bible, that any Bible is the infallible Word of God. All he will own up to is a collection of manuscripts which were not a Bible when they were written. There was no such thing as the Bible when Paul wrote Corinthians and Ephesians, unquote. The apologist Josh McDowell made an exceedingly inept comment with respect to this whole matter. On page 84 in his book entitled Evidence for Faith, Practical Apologetics. In fact, one could say without fear of exaggeration that he really put his foot in his mouth on this one. But first, some background information. The liberal Protestant scholar Julius Wellhausen developed a theory about 100 years ago that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch or Torah, were not composed by Moses, as fundamentalists allege, but they came from 4 different documents which he labeled J, E, D, and P. Of course, fundamentalists hold this theory in contempt and attack it whenever possible. While discussing Wellhausen's thesis, McDowell says, quote, "Now what do we have? We have 4 documents, 4 sources. Now realize that no one has ever seen these documents," unquote. Did you get that? He says, no one has ever seen these documents. Talk about faith, blind faith. McDowell is bold enough to allege that no one has ever seen these documents, the documents lying at the core of Wellhausen's theory, when that is precisely the position of his Bible. That is exactly the position in which he finds himself. He criticizes another individual for practicing the same baseless scholarship upon which his whole philosophy of life rests. No one has ever seen the original biblical documents. McDowell completes his final descent into quicksand by stating the following on page 87. Quote, "Would you feel confident about your theory of how the Bible was written if it were based on a set of documents no one had ever seen and an editor no one knows?" While criticizing Wellhausen's theory, McDowell appears wholly unable to realize that he's blowing his own theory, his own philosophy of life, right out of the water, because his attack is directly applicable to the Bible. Not only are the Bible's authors unknown, but no one has ever seen the originals. So how can anyone, anybody, be sure of anything they say? Realizing that the whole subject of biblical reliability is very insecure, Harold Lindsell, in his book entitled The Battle for the Bible, tries one last desperate gambit. On page 37, he states the following, quote, "It must be remembered that those who scoff at the inerrancy of the autographs, the originals," and I think he's referring to people like me, "because they can't be produced for examination, have no better case arguing for the errancy of a text they can't produce either. At the worst, it's a standoff," unquote. In other words, when all else has failed, Lindsell has decided that although he can't prove the originals are perfect, opponents can't prove they aren't. Talk about a pathetic approach. As I have said so often in regard to the existence of God, the burden of proof lies on him who alleges. It is the Achilles heel of the entire religious superstitious movement. It is the lethal injection for all supernatural superstitious thought. Rational people are not saying that God does not exist. They are only asking those who believe in a God to prove He does. After all, they're the ones that keep bringing up the word, the concept, the idea. And by the same token, when it comes to the inerrancy of the Bible, its advocates are required to provide adequate evidence of the inerrant originals, because certainly everything that comes after them is full of errors and contradictions. Why on earth anybody would assume that the originals have no mistakes when all of the copies reek with errors and contradictions is beyond me. That's a leap in logic only the irrational can understand. Of course, the problem lies in the fact that there's no logic involved. The entire "you have to go back to the originals" defense is basically the mark of a desperate man trying to defend a hopeless position. So what can we conclude from our analysis of the originals? Essentially, it's this. When somebody gives you a book, be it the Revised Standard, the King James, the New International, the New American Standard, or what have you, all they're doing is giving you a book that was translated from some originals, a book translated from some manuscripts, not from originals, from some manuscripts that are supposedly accurate copies of some original writings that no longer exist and no one living has ever seen. So we go from the writing you have to the manuscripts to the originals that no one has ever seen.